welcome for joining us. This is going to be a video conversation where we explore the concept of shame, both in terms of our faith as well as mental health and well-being. I'm Jonathan Hetterly. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I primarily work with teens, young adults, and adults. And I'm going to let my co-host today introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kobe. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I specialize in trauma, utilizing EMDR, and I mostly see young adults and people of color.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation. And for those of you that are listening in, there is an opportunity, I believe, where you guys are going to have a chance to ask questions, that there's going to be a later panel where we try to tackle some of the questions you might have from this chat on shame. I guess maybe one of the most helpful things would be for the folks that are watching this to give them a little bit of an idea or a definition of what we mean, what we're talking about when we use the term shame. And so, Kobe, I'm curious whether it's a formal definition or just kind of what comes to mind for you. How do you sort of make sense of this idea of or concept of shame?
Yeah, the concept of shame, I think a lot of people might define it as I am bad, that internal belief, whether it's said explicitly or kind of experienced and acted out of implicitly. But I like to kind of define shame with my clients and with myself as this idea that there's a part of myself I must keep to myself. Not there's a part of myself I can keep to myself out of wisdom, or a part of myself I want to keep to myself as a reflection of who I am, but a part of myself that I cannot share with other people, or else my life or my relationships or the things that I love are in danger. And so I have to hide a part of myself to be loved or accepted. I think that's how I conceptualize shame for the most part.
No, I love that concept. I would totally agree with this idea of hiding.
Yeah.
It's this fear of if we are exposed for who we really are, and if people really knew me, I'd be unlovable.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be likable. I'm
Yeah.
not worthy.
Yeah.
I'd be judged. And
Yeah.
so, and all of those are, none of those are what we want in terms of our relationships and our reputation. So we hide those parts of us, but part of hiding them oftentimes means we never really work through them, or we never are able to kind of change them.
Yeah.
That which stays hidden stays hidden.
Yeah.
Um, I heard there's a saying, I believe I hear it a lot in the recovery community. You're only as sick as your secrets. So it's this idea of the more we spend time and energy and resources like hiding and compartmentalizing and internalizing those parts that we're too afraid to expose or show others, that they stay that way.
Yeah.
We almost kind of crystallize them, that they become a part of our internal kind of state in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
And I love the fact that you use the word crystallize. It kind of makes me think of like a fossil. Like it's just like these layers of like rock that just like almost preserve the initial state of like that bone or whatever piece was found. And it just is like harder and harder to get to what the actual object is, because there's so much that has been hardened around it. And I think that's what happens when we experience shame in prolonged ways. Like when we experience shame from past traumatic experiences, when we keep it in the dark for a long time, we kind of let it fossilize.
Yeah. Well, let's build off of this concept of shame, this definition, or how we sort of flesh it out, and look at maybe some of the complicated relationship that shame has to Christians or even the church. And in a lot of ways we emphasize so much God's grace and God's unconditional love, and yet we come across so many people, pretty much everyone that I've ever encountered, that
Yeah.
wrestles with shame. How do you make sense of a Christian or the church, and yet shame infiltrates people's identity and belief?
Woo. it's it's hard to make sense of, but it's so easy to detect. And I think that's the most true answer I can give is I think that we have maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally built this culture of using the power of God on our behalf, right? But not receiving the grace of God for our brokenness. You
Mhm.
know, so many of us are like God's power is moving through me, but like we don't really like share why we need God's grace. We don't really share what things we need God's presence to touch. It makes me think of like this metaphor of like people who are believers like saying there's this living water and it's so amazing, and if you drink of it you'll never thirst again, and we're going out and telling people like there's this living water, you'll never thirst again, come to this oasis, come to this place where you can drink and be filled, right? And then everyone gets to the oasis and nobody wants to be seen going to get the first cup of water
Mhm.
because we're
You
all
know,
standing around.
when we were prepping for this conversation, you also shared a little bit of just maybe your own personal story and upbringing, and
Yeah,
even just messages that kind of subtly or maybe very explicitly seem to really reinforce this concept of shame. Would you share a
absolutely.
little bit more of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2013, so I come from a very African household. My parents are Ghanaian immigrants here in North Carolina. But when I was a sophomore in college, I tried to commit suicide. I was in complete and utter despair. And your despair was not something you shared with people. You don't talk about how much pain you're in. You don't talk about how sad you are. And if you do talk about it, it needs to be past tense. It needs to be something that's been conquered. It needs to be something that's been resolved. And it needs to be a clear story where at the end, you are the hero for conquering this really hard thing because, man, you just have some really awesome sheer will and you just have a great source of internal morality and you're a great person. And
Mhm.
for me, I got to that place of despair because I felt like I can't share this. Like if I share how much pain I'm in, I will not be accepted, I will be rejected. And for me, it was, I would rather die. Like I remember feeling that despair before I met the Lord. Like I would rather die. And even now, as a clinician, walking with people as they express, like I've thought about dying before. I've thought about how I don't want to be here anymore, but no one can know that. No one can know that I'm in such despair. I think that we have to build cultures and have conversations about the reality of what we are feeling and not just what we should be feeling.
You know, I think about, I grew up in a church. I'm adopted, so I was raised in a Caucasian family, and we went to this neighborhood church that I would describe as very fundamentalist. So
Mhm.
very, very rigid, legalistic.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember, first of all, like I've never doodled on any church bulletin more in my life than upbringing going to my church. But I remembered the 45-minute sermons each week. About 42 minutes of it was just highlighting how horrible
Mhm.
humanity was and how sinful and depraved and empty and misguided and misdirected and lustful and carnal that I was and that humanity was.
Yeah.
And then there'd be the last 3 minutes about that's why you need Jesus and that's how great God is.
Yeah.
And I think throughout Christian history, there's been this difficulty in finding that balance of how do you elevate God's grace without shaming and belittling
Yeah.
humans. And I think it's an art form. I think you can highlight our need for Christ without making us feel like such horrific, horrible, unworthy, unlovable people. Because if anything, the gospel message is God loves us. It's not that we're unlovable. It's that we're not able to be that key that unlocks salvation through ourselves or our good work. So
Yeah.
that was the message very early on I attached to the Christian faith and the church. And I think here now, 30 some years later, hearing what you just shared about your own struggles, we would never, ever broach any of that.
Ever.
Talking about shame and even being critical of the Christian community or the church. I
Yeah,
would never hear any of that. It was always about how God is untouchable and great, and
yeah,
how we without him are just lost and misguided. And
yeah,
that can really shape a person's theology and how they view themselves in
yeah,
that unworthiness.
yeah.
Um,
It makes me think about the difference of how we communicate the gospel, right? Like I work with a couple clients who are struggling through religious trauma and struggling with suicidality because they feel like the way the gospel is being communicated to them, if they are not worthy, why are they here?
mm,
Right? If they just can't get it right, what is the point? Right. And it's almost like this negative approximation of the gospel is like feeding their pathologies because they're not seeing, like you were talking about, the grace net, because they're only hearing the 3 minutes versus the 42 minutes. And I think like the difference of what I think the gospel in many contexts has been shared as and what the gospel is like we talk about human beings like we're just like terrible, evil human beings, and Jesus came to save us and to destroy our flesh and to make it new. And I understand the underlying context of that, but I think that like we have to look at it as almost like a computer system, right? You look at there's hardware and there's malware. The hardware exists and the malware affects the hardware, right? And to think about like human goodness is the hardware. Sin comes and sin is the malware. Now Jesus comes as a little, virus cleaner, and he comes and restores the malware back to its hardware, back to how the hardware was supposed to operate. And it's not about Jesus coming to destroy humanity to make it new. Jesus comes to restore humanity, to restore the goodness that was already there. And I have found that that is fundamental for my clients who are struggling with religious trauma, because the idea that like actually you were created good and sin came to corrupt something, and you are not fundamentally sinful in the way that God did not create you wrong, but wrongness has come into the equation and corrupted things. That has been such a shift for people because they're like, oh, I am not bad. And it's like, no, you are affected by evil,
mm.
right? You are sinful because sin has come into the equation and affected you. But Jesus comes to restore the goodness that was there before the sin was there.
Yeah, that's a great way of sort of conceptualizing it, and in a lot of ways we're highlighting, even through our own spirituality or just our humanness, being
Mm,
able to talk openly about that. The
yeah,
church largely has not been a safe place for us to do that. It's to hide that and put on
yeah,
really nice clothes and
yeah,
act in a manner that's expected,
yeah,
on Sunday mornings. And then that part of us never gets attention, never gets, worked on, or in some ways, um, change, healed, find freedom in that. But I want to shift now because we've kind of highlighted that complicated relationship with shame and the Christian faith or the church. But now let's talk about, something that you and I specialize in and we spend a lot of time addressing, which is mental health.
yeah,
And shame is not just exclusive to a moral faith belief system. We see a lot of shame that's directly tied into a person's mental health, their overall well-being. Why don't you share a little bit of some of your observations and experience in your work?
yeah. In my work, I've found that the function of shame has like almost been to prevent like the damaging or the loss of really important relationships. Because like when you look at when people feel shame, there's always this cost that they're afraid that there will be if they are exposed, right? They're like shame, like you mentioned before, makes us hide. And they're like, well, if people see this, then blank. And for everyone, the fill in the blank is different. But it it I think it's so important for us to think about like the very basic, fight, flight, freeze. For
Hmm.
many people, when they're experiencing shame, like they are experiencing physically terror in their bodies, right? Terror that someone will see me, terror that someone will judge me, terror that someone will ostracize me. And, you know, as we were preparing, you said something that was so true. I wrote it down for myself. Sometimes that fear is based in something that actually might happen, right? So sometimes like we can fall into the place of being like, oh, like if you're afraid, it's just fear. But like no, from some people that fear is a reference to real experiences, real rejection. And I find that people who struggle with shame often struggle with sleep,
Hmm.
struggle with resting,
Oh, yeah.
right? I must, because you're persistently hiding. You have to anticipate what situation someone might see a part of you that you're trying to remain in the dark. And I think it's also so important that we realize that when people are experiencing shame in their bodies, shame is processed the same way physical pain is, right?
Yeah.
I don't know a single person who's experienced shame and had no physical symptom of it, right? It's increased heart rate, it's their breathing's affected, they're perspirating, you know, they may be shaking. Shame is something that affects us holistically. It
Mm.
affects how we interact interpersonally. It makes it easy to serve people, to talk to them, to lead them, to show them, but it makes it very difficult to connect to them. So it leaves us in this place where we're maybe always around people, physically, or can be around people. Some people do physically isolate, but we can be around people, but this psychosocial loneliness is like ever present.
Yeah. So much of what you're talking about just comes back to the concept that you laid out for us at the beginning, which is hidden.
Yeah.
So much about mental health is not visible.
Mm,
And that really creates a lot of times other people's struggle to believe and trust that
mm,
what somebody is reporting is going on internally is true, it's accurate.
yeah.
It's so devastating. It's so encouraging when I come across an individual that's struggling with depression or anxiety or trauma,
Yeah.
and a loved one doesn't believe them, or they say, well, you're just lazy,
Yep.
or if you just prayed more,
Yep.
or just don't worry about that. And they, in some ways, even if they're trying to help, it can be
Yeah.
very flippant and dismissive. But a lot of times there's these subtle messages of like, is she really telling the truth? Is he really telling the truth?
Yeah. Or
And
it's your fault.
yeah. And so then it creates this stigma and judgment, which again, then this shame, because it keeps coming back to whatever is ailing you, whatever you're struggling with, it's largely because of you.
Hmm.
And so if you're struggling, it's your fault.
Yeah.
Here's all these really simple, quick fixes, and if it isn't getting better, then
Yeah.
it's your fault. And it's this trap of like miscalculated responsibility.
Yeah.
I did not get to choose my brain.
Yeah.
I did not get to choose the
Hmm.
family that I was raised in.
Yeah.
There is so much of this world that I have zero control around, but
Yeah.
it impacts me, and it can radically alter the way my brain processes stress, fear, sadness. Uh,
Mm,
and that's really, in a lot of ways, what I see as the stigma that comes with mental health. We've made so much advancements, and there has been this ongoing kind of national mission to destigmatize
yeah.
mental health and mental illness. But the reason that we're having to put so much emphasis on that is we see the struggle. It is a struggle for people to believe what they can't see,
Yeah.
to trust people's self-reporting of what's going on.
Yeah.
And that comes from, I think, a lot of times our overly rational mind. It's like, if I can't see it, if you can't prove it,
Hmm.
then are you kind of just overreacting? Are you a little kind of dramatic? Are you overly sensitive? I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's just going to make it unsafe. And then folks with struggles are going to do what you already described. We're going to hide it. We're going to
Yeah.
keep it to ourselves. And then if we keep it to ourselves and we hide it, it never can get the attention it needs in order for it to get better.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said I didn't get to choose the brain I have. I feel like it's such a simple sentence, but I know that there's so many people who resonate with that statement because I do. I was like, oh, yeah. And like even that shame of being like, I'm sorry. I wish I could, it didn't hurt so bad. I wish I wasn't so affected. I
Mhm.
wish I wasn't so sad. I wish I wasn't so angry. I wish I wasn't so moved by the things that are around me. But we didn't get to choose the brains that we have. And many people, I think, just needed to hear that.
And so, whether it's shame from a theological perspective or shame that comes from mental health and the stigma behind it, both of those, I think, have really created an environment where the church has largely not been a safe place to open up and reveal that which is hidden, that which we are so afraid that if people knew about us,
Yeah,
that they would judge us, they
yeah,
would think of us differently,
yeah,
and it kind of perpetuates our own worries of, am I lovable? Am I good enough? Am I a good enough uh, spouse, parent,
yeah,
community member within the church? All of these, these concepts of insecurity and
um,
inadequacy.
mm,
And that's really what transformation is really trying to do through their communities. How do we break the stigma? How do we make the church a safe place where humans can talk about the very real struggle it is to be a human, a faithful Christian and a human,
yep,
because it's
yeah.
hard.
It's hard. It is hard. I think we start to make steps towards that when we make space for the reality that two things can be true. I can be struggling with depression and anxiety, and I still can be loved by the Lord, love the Lord, and serve well.
Yeah.
Right? They're like sometimes we think that like, and I know that I've experienced this in church before. It's like no one can know what I'm struggling with, or else I can't serve anymore. No
Mm,
one can know what I'm doing or what's hurting me, or else like I won't be accepted as a leader, or I'll be questioned as a leader. But like, what if we built a culture where we moved and interacted with such radical vulnerability that it
mm.
was okay and celebrated to be broken and used by the Lord, because that's ultimately what we're called to do as human beings, right? We're here in the almost but not yet,
Mm.
meaning we're all going to experience this brokenness, and that doesn't mean God can't use us or God can't move through us, but it means that we have to do the very antithesis of what shame does. Shame brings us down and in. We have to come up and out and be honest about what it means to be in the human experience. And it sounds so simple, but like to listen
Yeah.
to what people are saying and not to try to listen so we can say, this is what you need to do, but listen so that we can hear if there's a part of us that connects to the pain that they're experiencing.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, when we think about how can Christians, how can the church combat this destructive effect of shame on people, the word that you just mentioned was vulnerability and honesty and truth. And so much of that rings true to people, and yet we have such difficulty living it out. So it's these concepts that we champion, but it's really messy and it's scary. It's
Yeah,
scary to live them out in relationship and in community, because part of being vulnerable is, instead of hiding, we expose all the elements of our life, our strengths, what we celebrate, but our failures and what our struggles. And when you're vulnerable, I mean, the reason we call it vulnerability is that people can hurt us in that state. We're not protecting ourselves, we're not guarded.
yeah,
And there's so much about humanity and the church that we unintentionally maybe are wired to be passive aggressive towards one another. Like,
yeah,
in my church growing up, it was like the prayer the prayer chain was 55% general care and concern and lifting people up, and 45% like gossip, like, oh, here's what's going on in people's lives, oh,
Yep.
things of that nature. um how do we make the church a safe place for people to be real and to be vulnerable? That's the challenge, but it's also the opportunity. If we think about how people will associate the church as a place where there really is healing and
Yeah.
there's community and there's empathy. That's really another word that I got from what you just were sharing, is like empathy, sharing in people's pain, believing in people's pain,
Yeah.
walking with them. But empathy is really about connecting, right? It's putting
Yep.
yourself in other people's shoes.
Yeah.
We as a culture, as a species, we're very uncomfortable with our own pain, and we're
Yes.
very uncomfortable with other people's pain.
Almost offended by
Yeah,
it. Almost
because
offended.
because it's intrusive in our own like well-being and happiness or obliviousness, like because it's hard to ignore pain, right? And so we try to offer up these overly simplified, very shallow, and more often than not, very misguided kind of solutions and remedies of like, oh, just do this, or, oh, I've dealt with that too. That all you need
Mm-hmm.
to do is this.
And give it to the Lord. Just surrender it to Him. Leave it at the altar. And, as you were talking about vulnerability, I think so. You had said, like, what makes vulnerability so hard? I feel like what makes vulnerability so hard is that no one can master it.
Hmm.
Vulnerability is a moving target. Once you get used to sharing, so vulnerability for me at one time was sharing that I had tried to commit suicide. But now that's no longer vulnerability for me. That's no longer true vulnerability. It still takes a sense of vulnerability to share that, but that's not something that I feel uncovered by. That's not something that puts me at the mercy of somebody else anymore, right? So when God calls me to be vulnerable, for a season, sharing that suicide attempt was vulnerability. But now there's other things, right? Now there are other things that God is like, share this. All right, let's go a little deeper. Share this thing. This thing is a thing that would open you up to the mercy of other people. Thing is a thing that you've been hiding in like this dark corner. And I think vulnerability is hard because we love mastering things in our culture. We love becoming experts at things. And I know I'm definitely in that track too. But like vulnerability is something that nobody can master. And so it never becomes this thing that is that is it always costs us. That's the best
True.
way to put it.
Yeah.
Vulnerability at every season will cost us, and we have to understand that if we want to build a culture that is vulnerable.
Yeah. I mean, I keep going back to that hiding and versus, being real and open up. Our culture right now, there's all these ongoing conversations of like social media and that being very image conscious and performative versus authentic. I would argue that the church has struggled with that a lot longer before social media ever became a thing, that
Okay.
there is this struggle of performative faith.
Yeah.
People
That's so
come to church and they put on this exterior that just is so proper and pious, uh, and but the Monday through Saturday struggles we leave at home. And this idea of like, and part of it though is, how do we combat shame? It's like we all need it, if we want to be honest and open, it starts with the leadership. It starts from the top of
Yep.
leaders being able to say, listen, um, I struggle with my faith sometimes. I question, does God hear me sometimes? I struggle with depression or anxiety, or there have been times when alcohol has been a problem.
Yeah.
I feel insecurity or doubts of like, am I a good enough parent? And that makes it real, and that makes it safer
Yeah.
for everyone to say, oh, well, wow, if the leaders of this flock struggle with that,
Yeah.
and then it must be a pretty normal thing that it doesn't reflect poorly on your faith or what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're about to slide into preaching. You were about to slide into preaching, and your language was so perfect because you use present tense. So often we only want to talk about what we went through
Mm,
as source material for how we can lead other people.
yep.
But God is leading us and asking us to share what we're going through and the uncertainty of the God, I'm believing, but help my unbelief. The
Yeah.
uncertainty of how things are going to turn out, the uncertainty of how I'm going to get out of this depressive episode, the uncertainty of I don't know what's going to remedy my anxiety, the uncertainty of that, because it doesn't make us an expert over somebody else. Like God is leading us to share what we're going through in the moment and not just like, oh, I struggled with this in the past, but these are the 3 steps you need to take to conquer anxiety for the rest of the year. Like he's asking us, like, share where you're at now, not where you used to be. And there's nothing wrong with us sharing where we used to be. But I think part of building that vulnerable culture that combats shame is sharing, this is what I'm going through right now. This is what I'm believing God for right now. And I think we'd find that there's so much community in that present struggle and everyone's isolated in their own little spaces. And how powerful would it be if we came together and held each other in that hardship?
Yeah, I really like how you framed that, because if we only are real once the outcome is optimized,
Mm,
then we rob people of sharing in the journey and the struggle. It's
yeah,
one thing to say, like, I overcame this, God is great. It's another to say, I am going through this, and God is great, and God
yeah,
is present,
wow,
and God is faithful. um, but to see people in their current brokenness
yeah,
and the struggle, because life is hard. Life is hard.
difficult.
Struggling with your mental health, it's hard. Parenting is hard. Marriage is hard. Career and expectations, it's hard.
Yep.
Can we meet people with that and acknowledge, yeah, it's hard. And sometimes it's not all about, well, here's what we can do to show that you're more faithful of a believer, or that you're just a super, just efficient and successful human being. It's, how do we hold on? How do you make it through the day?
Surviving.
Survive.
Surviving. Yeah, and I think when our focus becomes being present with each other, we make space for the divine comfort of the Holy Spirit to come.
Hmm.
If we're always trying to provide the specific solution to someone's specific problem, where's the space for the divine comforter? There
Yeah.
is. And so maybe my job is just to sit with you and hold your hand as you cry, and let's see how God shows up. Let's see how God takes, our fish and our loaves of bread and breaks it and multiplies it into something that we could never imagine. But like when we try to skip over the presence with
Hmm.
people, I feel like it re-traumatizes them really, right? And it can make them feel like my pain is not worth being seen, it's only being worth erased.
Yeah.
Like this is making you, and even if people don't have a language for that, they can sense that, right? Like, oh, you're trying to give me a solution because you don't feel comfortable with how much pain I'm in.
Hmm.
You want me to be over and done with it. But when we sit
Yeah.
with people, we say, hey, for however long you feel this, you are loved. For however long you endure this pain, this suffering, this anguish, you are loved. I am here and God is here with you. That is what is transformative. God with us, not God fixing us.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you and I feel very comfortable to push back or critique the church community, but that's only because we recognize what its mission truly is, in terms of building community and being a safe place where people can recognize, like, life is hard. There's got to be more to life than just this. And but we can also be celebrated and loved for who we are, where we are, versus we
Yeah,
have to do all this work in order to enter those doors. Or when
yeah,
we enter those doors, we have to hide all this other stuff to feel like we're going to be accepted, that we'll be loved. And
yeah,
all of those just perpetuate this shame cycle where we have this very distorted view of, I'm only lovable if people don't know this about me.
Yeah.
I can only be embraced if I never tell anybody about this.
Yeah.
And yet we all have struggles, and the whole point of community is to share in the struggles together,
Yeah.
share in the burden together. That's
Yep.
part of the beauty of psychotherapy and counseling, is that there's somebody, that a time and a place and a space where you're going to get non-judgment, where you can just say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm going through. And it's scary and it's frustrating. And a lot of times I don't know what to do. And more often than not, one of the first things that I respond to with folks in therapy is, you're not alone. I,
Yeah.
I hear this all the time. So many people are going through this. It's just, we don't live in a world that makes it safe to talk about it out. We have to go to a private, confidential office, and then we have to work through that discomfort and worry of like, are you going to judge me? Are you going to
Yeah.
see me differently? Are you going to treat me differently? And that's just a really sad truth that I think a lot of us can relate to and we've experienced.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that we get to embody in our profession that divine comfort that I was talking about. And, like you said about us critiquing the church, I think a lot of it is because we see the potential for this to be experienced in God's house.
Mhm.
Like we see that potential, and we see the longing. We see the long because people come into our offices in utter despair, and how much of that despair is just like touched just by our presence,
Mm.
just by our undivided attention on them.
Yeah. Well, listen, I've really, really appreciated and enjoyed this conversation on shame, and hopefully, folks that have been listening, we hope that this has provoked, or been a catalyst for some your own personal reflection, but also even just to generate some questions you may have about shame, about mental health, or even this great opportunity but challenge we all face, which is how to make the church a safe place for people to be people,
Yeah.
um, either in terms of developing their faith or managing their mental health and their struggles. And so I really encourage folks to follow up and submit questions, and then join the roundtable Q&A panel that also is going to be presented. But Kobe, this has been a true delight. I've always appreciated our time and our conversation. We could go on for hours and hours,
We could
obviously.
talk forever. I love when you talk. Like I said, you be sliding into preaching. So I'm gonna start calling you Bishop. I love it.
No, I don't want any thunder coming down. But thank you for your time. We appreciate those that are watching. We hope that this has been helpful, and God bless and thank you.
Yeah,
Take care.
thank you guys.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.